Thanks for tuning in, guys. You're listening to Ace Comicals. I'm Greg Driver. I'm joined by Rahul Jani and Leon Everett. Let's go! Hello everybody and welcome to episode number 80 of Ace Comicals, and today we have with us a special guest, and that is Vicki Madden, or Dr Vicki Madden now.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction.
Yeah, so Vicki was last with us when we discussed Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. I think that was like season 1 we did, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a while ago. I'm not entirely sure how long, but it was it's been a while.
It was all the way back in November of 2018, which was episode 48. For those of you who want to go back and reference that, you can go find it in our back catalogue. Yeah,
we had a very interesting discussion about the first season of Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which was really cool. And we're on season 3 now. So has anyone started watching that yet?
I was just watching it before joining you guys, but I'm not very far into it, and it's interesting. A lot of cosmic horror going on, so not entirely irrelevant to today.
Yeah, I watched. I've seen like the first episode and part of the second episode of it, I think. So I'm not really very far through it, but the first episode's got like this whole Wizard of Oz vibe, which I thought was pretty fun. Yeah, so I mean, as always, I've got Ray and Leon with me as co-hosts.
Evening all. Hello.
Hello.
And today we are doing a Junji Ito centric episode. So the goal of today is to discuss Junji Ito's unique brand of horror and his work in comics and manga, and just to have fun with some of the crazy weirdness that he has committed to the page over the years, over the last 30 years, in fact. So I'll just start by basically saying that Junji Ito's work is rather famous, and for the uninitiated, this is the man who has produced some of the most critically acclaimed horror manga to date, which have been adapted for television and into numerous films and animated features. I mean, I guess you could have even seen some of these without realizing, because recently there's been an anime series as well, hasn't there, that adapts some of his short stories. In 2019, he received an Eisner for his manga adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And he was also nominated in 2003 for the best US edition of foreign material, and that was for Uzumaki, which is something that we read and we'll get onto later on in this cast. I guess his career in manga has spanned the last 30 years, and I suppose we and many others would regard him as one of the modern masters of horror, especially where sequential art is concerned. So, before we get really, really deep into the point of no return with the Junji Ito stuff, does anyone have anything they want to get out of the way and off their chest first of all? Things they might have been watching, things they may...
Have any of you seen Parasite?
Yes.
I have indeed.
Yeah, that was just my film. I just watched it recently, so that was my film of 2019. But I don't know if that really feeds into anything we're going to talk about today. I thought it might, but but maybe not.
No, I would say it does. There's a lot of connections you could make between the two. I guess, well, the main setup of... It's hard to talk about Parasite because it's a thing that I would recommend people going completely blind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you and I were just talking about this at the weekend, Leon, about how going in blind was the best way to do it, because based on who the director is and his body of work and the title of the film, not knowing anything about it, as you put it, the film could be anything. You have no idea what you're getting from that movie, and I think it really subverted my expectations.
That's a very good recap. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Because I should say a very broad overview would be that you start the film with a family who you could say are on the lower end of the economic ladder, you could say, and the film broadly is about their interactions with a well-to-do upper middle class rich family, and in the old parlance of like movie posters and stuff, hilarity ensues and all around weird and craziness ensues. But I'd honestly go into it blind as possible.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, like, I've been almost a hermit recently. Like, I've not been to the cinema at all. I've not seen any of these films. Basically, just a peek behind the curtain on the run sheet. Ray has made a heading with brief movie, Oscar, other medium talk, and I know nothing about any of this because I live under a rock. I haven't seen Parasite. I haven't seen The Farewell, and I haven't seen Cats.
Well, I mean, Parasite was hard to view. It had like one or two maybe really like short run screenings in London, so I had to like run to catch that. But otherwise, I don't think it would be easy to have seen yet.
Yeah, I think it hits the UK fully on wide release on the 7th of February, I believe.
Cool. Judging from what people have been saying, Cats is basically a horror movie, right? With the weird special effects and everything else.
That's precisely the reason I put it on the list. It sounds like a trippy headfuck.
It's terrible. I was not going to say how I was watching this, but I found a copy, and whatever you think it might be, if you haven't seen it, it is about 10 times worse. It is honestly an abomination, and I don't know how this got made. I don't know like how it happened that no one in the studio questioned this and everyone thought this would be a good idea. It's like probably scarier, I think, in terms of visuals than like anything I've seen this year, including Midsummer, Hereditary the year before. It is just like your trippiest fever dream mixed with I don't know. It's the costuming. I mean, even on Broadway, they knew to make the noses cat-like, right? But in the film, they just leave them as human noses, and there's something so abhuman about that weird anthropomorphic, like people in cat suits, but like they've got fluffy ears. It's just horrendous. I can't.
Cats with creepy faces, a la Yon and Moo, which we'll get onto later again in this cast. But
yeah.
Well, everything I've seen of Cats in the trailers, it has that thing where it looks like it punches the Uncanny Valley right in the face.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. It feels like it's got a nice, weird parallel to Junji Ito, because it's like how there's a lot of people out there who may never have read Junji Ito's body of work, or have never really read manga, but there's a high percentage chance that just by being like existing on the internet, they'll have seen some of the like the mimetic images that have come out of his work. And I feel like Cats is doing the same thing, where I don't think I'm going to go watch that film, but I've seen some of the messed up stuff and that people have been screenshotting and passing around on Twitter.
Oh yeah, it's like developed a life of its own. Sorry.
Sorry, no, carry on. That's my fault.
No, it's just like, it's one of those things where like a lot of Junji Ito's work, I guess, it's just kind of like, it's gotten away from the source, and it's kind of developed a life of its own now, and in popular culture. And I just like people using, like, do you see that thing where someone had like dubbed over the trailer music from Us over the Cats trailer?
Yeah,
it worked brilliantly.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
It was probably my favorite thing of last year. I was just like, this just works so well. And so in its afterlife, Cats has just become, I think, the horror movie of 2019.
Yeah, I've seen the trailer, and it looks like I swear in some places the faces kind of like are like unattached to the bodies. So like when you see the faces move, it's almost like they go off center slightly because they're superimposed over the weird cat bodies or whatever, and it's just like the faces kind of come off the bodies. I don't know. It's weird.
I know what you mean, and I think it's like it's with the dancing. There's a lot of like, I think, isolations involved in like the ballet moves, and it just looks like their faces are just kind of wrong because cats' bodies obviously don't move that way. And I don't know, for some reason, like this musical was one of my favorites when I was little, and I didn't. This is before I think I had an understanding of what the uncanny was, because the musical itself is quite uncanny. But it didn't offend me in such a way as to put me off. But the film, for some reason, it just gives me the heebie-jeebies.
I love the word offend in this context. Like, yeah, it's offensive to the senses.
It really is, though. And you know what was the worst part is, like, there's this bit where Rebel Wilson's cat, like, unzips her skin.
Oh, yeah. I've seen that, yeah. I've seen that in the GIF.
It's very Junji Ito, though, in that sense of just, like, why do you have more skin underneath? It's terrifying. I don't like it.
So, let's just hope that Disney don't take a cue out of this, but with the recent slew of live actions Disney have been sort of like churning out, and do something similar to this with Aristocats or something like that.
Well, don't give them ideas, please.
The thing is, there is like an avenue for that type of thing, because this is a living movie, isn't it? It had DLC updates straight to the cinema because they hadn't finished the VFX on it. So
yeah, graphics patches.
Yeah, exactly. This is something I could see Disney doing now that they're going to conquer the world using Disney Plus. I could see that happening.
Day one movie patches.
I want a whole film where every single line of dialogue is replaced by the word McClunky.
You could make that yourself.
I'm sure somebody will.
So, I guess we should move on now, because we've already been kind of hinting at it, and I've already introduced it. So I guess we should move on and kind of get into the thick of what this podcast was actually going to be about, which was Junji Ito's work. So, before we do that, I should introduce our guest properly. So we have with us Vicki Madden today. PhD in Gothic literature.
Yes, very recently inaugurated PhD. But it still stands. So,
yeah, I mean, this was meant to be the first episode of the year, but then what we did was we decided to delay it so that Vicky could finish her PhD defense and get all of that out of the way and speak to us freely and without stress when we were doing this. So, so you've finished it. You've got no corrections, I think you were saying before we started recording.
Yeah, it's done.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting that at all, but it's just the best possible outcome. Like, they told me I had no corrections, and I just burst into tears because it was just the culmination, I think, of 4 years of me looking at my computer screen and thinking, what am I doing with my life? So, yeah, exciting.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
And so how do you, like, now that it's all over, how have you been spending your time? What have you been up to?
I'm still slightly traumatized, I think, from the process. So I keep trying to read things and then giving up like 20 pages in because I'm like, I'm not enjoying this yet. And I don't know when I'm going to start enjoying reading for pleasure again. But rereading some Junji Ito, I think that was a really good way of kind of rediscovering my love of reading and stuff, because it's just so easy to just finish a novel like in like half an hour. I think it took me to read like Geo, the first book, and just read it kind of over my lunch, and it was great. It's been nice to not have like the thesis or corrections or anything hanging over my head, which is, the first time in a very long time that I've had that freedom.
Just like the lifting of an enormous weight.
Oh yeah.
Which I'm guessing is like 10 times whatever I've felt when I finished high school exams and things like that. But yeah. So on to the main event. So each of us have kind of like, we've all read like a different collection of things, as far as, because Junji Ito, his career has spanned like 30 years, and there's like a lot of different, within that he's done a lot of different short stories, a lot of different things, and I think we've actually got quite a good cross section across all of us, haven't we? Looking at it. So if we just sort of run through what each of us has read in preparation for this cast. So I will start, and I have read Joe, The Sad Tale of the Principal Post, The Enigma of Amigara Fault, which is probably one of his most famous ones. This is the one that people tend to meme a lot on the internet. So if you see any memes with like manga artwork people climbing into holes in mountains, then that's where it's from. Uzumaki, which was my favorite one actually. Junji Ito's Cat Diary. Yonamu, his adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is actually really, really good. And Next Spectre. Ray, do you want to go next?
Let me just pull up my list. Hang on. So the big novel that I read was, and I'm sorry to be a bit of a weeb and point out yours and Vicky's pronunciation, but it's Gyo, which means fish in Japanese. So I read Gyo. I read The Sad Tale of the Principal Post, which is attached to the end of that. The Enigma.
Sorry, Ray, can I just interrupt you very slightly? You know, when you corrected us, did you adjust your glasses?
I did with my index finger, and then the translucency flashed white as I did it. It was very cool, I assure you. So I read The Sad Tale of the Principal Post, The Enigma of Amigara Fault, Red Turtleneck, I think was the title of that one. The Hanging Balloons, The Window Next Door, The Ice Cream Bus, The Unbearable Labyrinth, and The Face Burglar. And most of those were short stories from one of his other series. I can't remember what it's called.
I mean, I've seen some of the anime as well, and I can't remember which one of these have and haven't been adapted. Because I mean, Gyo got adapted, didn't it? Gyo had an OVA animated feature.
I wouldn't know actually. I didn't check out any of the animation for this. I wasn't aware that there was any what's the word?
Yeah.
Filmmaking done of this until recently.
Gyo has a live action film, I believe, as well.
Uzumaki has a live action as well. And Uzumaki's getting another live action this year, isn't it?
I did see something about... Hang on, I've got a note here which says that Adult Swim are going to be doing a 4-part episode miniseries of Uzumaki later this year.
Yeah.
But we can talk about that later.
Yeah, and also just to point out, Junji Ito was going to be part of the Dream Team supergroup that were going to make Silent Hills.
R.I.P.
Did you ever hear about that?
Let's not talk about that. That's a really sad tale.
He was there with the rest of these evil geniuses, but yeah. Leon, what do you read?
I read or reread Uzumaki, Tomie, Gyo, and the 2 short stories at the end of Gyo, which are The Sad Tale of Principal Post and The Enigma of Amigara Fort. I read Voices in the Dark. I'll probably focus any comments particularly on Glyceride. And I read Fragments of Horror, focusing on Futon and Lingering Farewell. Voices in the Dark and Fragments of Horror are anthology books that contain a lot of Ito's short stories.
And Vicky, what did you read?
So I read Uzumaki a long time ago. Ray, thank you for helpfully pointing out that the only Asian here has mispronounced Gyo. But reread that one and read Tomie is actually one of my favorites. Didn't get a chance to reread it, but would love to talk about it just because it's I find that gender kind of aspect of it very interesting. Did get a chance to reread Junji Ito's Cat Diary and reread my favorite short story, I think, from Fragments of Horror called Blackbird. So with the bird woman, it's quite a good one. But we own most of whatever he's written that's been translated into English. I think my husband's reading his newest one at the moment. I can't remember what it's called, but he's just got we saw that there was one on Amazon that's just been released, but I think it's an adaptation of someone else's story. But he's reading that in the moment and he says it's weird and not sure he's enjoying it.
So Leon, have you ever seen any of the adaptations? Because you're a film guy. Have you actually watched any of them? Or
no, I haven't, because I'm a film guy, but I'm not a big fan of a lot of manga adaptations into live action. The few that I've dabbled in, it was mostly via having watched an anime and watching the live action. I've not been too much a fan of. Even the ones that have got a lot of critical acclaim, they've really done it for me. But it was weird because technically, there being a Gyo film is what would have been my earliest introduction to Junji Ito, but the thing is, I just didn't go with it. I was like, oh, there's this weird fishy horror movie. I didn't know it was based on a manga, and it was being recommended by someone who had questionable tastes. So I was like, whatever. And it was only a couple years later, maybe a year or 2 years later, where someone else introduced me to the Enigma of Amigara Fault, and then I was right on the Junji Ito train.
Nice. So Glyceride is the one with the fat and the pimples on the guy's face, isn't it? And he squeezes them and...
Yeah, all the grease.
Yeah, the grease one, yeah.
All the grease.
I saw that in the anime. That's like one of the ones I watched, one of the episodes. I think there was that one and the one with the incredibly distinctive looking model, which I can't remember the name of that story.
Oh, I think it's just called Fashion Model, isn't it?
Maybe, yeah.
The one where, she kind of looks like a Modiglieri painting.
Yeah.
Yes, I think, we found that one the other day, because I quite like that one too.
Yeah, it was that and Glyceride that I saw as anime from the recent sort of anime adaptations, because it was like an ongoing TV series where they were like adapting his short stories, and that was kind of cool. So, where do you guys want to kick this off? Let's kick this off with the sort of like what it is that makes his horror unique. So for me, I think the uniqueness of his horror stories is the fact that it kind of blends what's traditionally Japanese horror and traditionally like very Western horror concepts together quite well. Like, there's nothing, because although it is Japanese horror, there's nothing like super overtly Japanese about some of it. Like a lot of the body horror stuff that he gets into as well, for me feels very Western. I don't know how you guys feel about that. And it's also the way that he takes something completely innocuous and takes it to the nth level and turns that into something horrifying. Like, a good example of that is with, Uzumaki, because it's just a spiral. It's a shape, it's an abstract concept. And then he manages to make that into something that's, horrible. Horrifying, like cosmic, this cosmic evil that the spiral, this cosmic malevolence that the spiral represents. So, I mean, like, how do you guys view that as in like his actual brand of horror? Like, do you kind of feel like I do about it, or do you think it's
like I definitely like there's obvious Western influence in his work, particularly the things to do with cosmic horror and everything that stems off that. But I would say that there is a definite Japaneseness to the stories, or his application of certain ideas and themes. While the core concepts are universal, I would say that they do speak to things in the Japanese psyche, in particular, things to do with the past and the different like traditions and mores of Japanese culture.
I would I would agree with Leon, actually. I think for me, like, his brand of horror is weird, like as in like the genre of weird fiction. And, like that, I think it would be a mistake to see that in isolation as like a Western tradition, because really the Japanese tradition of like Japanese kaidan, I think in Chinese it's called guaitan, but like Japanese weird fiction predates a lot of what we think of as like Western weird stories. So I think to me it is very much like, yes, I can see the influence of Lovecraft, I can see the influence of Poe, but there's also like a very distinct, I think, Asian tradition that he's working within.
Yeah, but it's not as there is that Western influence there. It's not like he's entirely, because a lot of traditional, I mean, in my experience, a lot of traditional Japanese horror is like it's mainly like the ghost stories and that type of stuff. but I don't know if
I think the older stuff, the stuff that's kind of quite closely related, traditional Chinese ghost stories, is very weird. You know, like kind of disembodied, like body parts kind of thing, like floating through the air. And so I think in just in terms of like the aesthetic and how weird it gets, like to me it recalls this kind of like very, very old tradition, which I suppose goes hand in hand with the Lovecraftian tradition, and just harking back at something that is like quite ancient and arcane and very hard to understand.
Yeah. Ray, what's your take on all this as well, actually?
Yeah, I think I kind of know what you're getting at, Greg, when you say that it's like quote unquote not so Japanese, because I think it's not. He doesn't have a lot of stuff which is making his own versions of established mythology, I think. But I'm glad that you brought up Kaidan, Vicky, because I think the stuff that I like the most is the stuff that is more like quote unquote like weird. I think the ones that that really stick out to me are like The Unbearable Labyrinth, I think. One which is very steeped in, there's a naturalism to it, but it's like a weird Buddhist monk, ancient sort of story naturalism. I think those are the ones that I am more drawn to. It's like that. And also the thing that I prefer is like the short stories, which have the Twilight Zone-esque, like it's a concept, and then he plays into that concept and then doesn't spend too much time in it. It's sort of like the big reveal at the end of the book and then it just ends. I think I like those where the lingering happens in your own head as opposed to it being drawn out into a whole novel. But I think that's just my preference on these things.
I would agree. I love that you. I think that's a really good comparison. I quite like the things that he does that are kind of like short vignettes that don't make a whole lot of sense, and you're just kind of like, so that was 4 pages. Like what's the one at the back of Gyo? The first one.
The Sad Tale of Principal Post.
Yes, that to me, it was so funny in kind of a way, like a very kind of like tragic comedy sense, and that I could almost see being like a Twilight Zone sketch, especially like now that Jordan Peele has kind of like rebooted the series. Like I can see that working potentially as like as a short like 20-30 minute kind of thing.
Yeah, because that's one of my favorites. Actually, it's one of the ones I had on my list particularly because it's so short. None of it's explained, and it's like there's the hint of a theme, or maybe that. And I didn't spend that long reading into it, but it's like the patriarch of the family is literally holding up the foundations of this house, and here's 4 pages on how that could be visually represented, and how it's like darkly comic, but also darkly tragic, and then it ends. And then it moves on to the Enigma of Amigara Fault, which is like deeply troubling and like unsettling. And like you barely have time to process just how messed up like a man being stuck under the pillar of foundation of his house is. And it's, I kind of just love that stuff.
Well, the Sad Tale of the Principal Post, that was one of the ones that actually got me laughing out loud. And that was because of the fact that, you know, it's not explained. He's just under the post.
Also, it came after like 2 hours of reading Gyo, which is like a descent into horribleness, and then you just
really
need
smelly horribleness.
Yeah, really stinky horribleness, and then you get like 4 pages of like a breath of fresh air, and I think that was the perfect story to be put in the perfect place at the end of that book.
You know, I just had like all these images in my head after like all these things, like these things that dads do, like when they just mess with stuff. For no reason. Like it's a brand new house, but they're just going to start like playing around with things and messing with things anyway.
Do you know what it brought to mind was Shaun of the Dead? Because it's like, it's the Junji Ito version of like the British dad going, oh, I'll run it under a cold tap. Like it's just, they find him under the house. He's like, no, don't worry. It's fine. I'll just die instead of going to all the trouble of going, you know, calling the ambulance or whatever.
It's more like if you try and move me, the house will fall down, isn't it? That's what he says.
But he's so immediately resigned to his fate. It's like, it's really funny.
But that's also a theme that runs throughout Junji Ito's work, isn't it? Protagonists and characters being resigned to their fate. And even though maybe a choice will sit before them and they can go in either direction, and they could avoid something in some ways, they still stay the path and they just carry on marching into madness. Especially with Uzumaki, because they know that, you know, they have a chance at the very beginning, because at the very beginning of the story, it's still possible to leave the town. And if all that stuff happened, you'd want to try and leave the town, wouldn't you? You wouldn't carry on and get stuck there. I think, is it the, I can't remember the name. This is terrible because, I've read so much and the names of the characters are starting to escape me. But the young man in Uzumaki, the main character's boyfriend.
Shuichi, was it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, he's the first person that notices there's something wrong. And he actually has the idea of leaving and not coming back. He's like, let's just go to the next town and just never come back. And it's like, if they'd have just done that in the first place, they could have avoided all of it. Like,
it's the equivalent of going out of the front door, but instead going up the stairs.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Everyone's just immediately resigned to their fate and they just carry on marching towards it.
Yeah, because elements of it are like this, like crippling inevitability, and like I think it shares, or at least like a cousin of like the Call of the Void. That whole thing of giving into impending doom and letting intrusive thoughts become, say, like a mental chorus, where by obsessing over the thing because you've noticed it and you want to avoid it, by letting it in, it's begun to corrupt you already. Yeah, and exactly. You see a lot of that, where in the end the characters end up surrendering their agency, and they, as you say, like they march towards madness. Yeah,
and I think that's one of the things that just makes it so compelling sometimes to carry on reading, because as much as it can appear frustrating, like why would you carry on doing that when you know that it's bad for you, kind of thing. It's still, like, you want to carry on and you want to see what happens, and in a way you're almost glad that they stay the course because you want to see where this is going to lead, because of the sort of culture of escalation that he has in his books, in his stories as well, especially in Gyo and Uzumaki, like the escalation and the sharpness of the upwards curve in how quickly things go absolutely like haywire is amazing. I mean, to get a bit deeper into I suppose Uzumaki, like the way, just within that story particularly, but like it's a good example actually of the way he does it. But throughout all of the stories I've read, actually, like an overarching thing, the way he manages to whip up such an oppressive atmosphere, and the way his art does that. So, I mean, he even elevates and manages to put his indelible mark on existing tales and classics. So with his Frankenstein adaptation as well, he manages to make it seem so oppressive and so dark. And it's to do with, I think, the way that he uses a lot of lines and a lot of shadows. And he just manages to keep things like really claustrophobic, almost in the same way, because it's different to, like, his artwork is different. Like the way that he seems to work and use techniques within sequential art seems to me very different to the way a lot of other mangaka work. As in, it's less dynamic. His work is definitely more static when I look at the panels. And that, like I was saying, there's a lot of lines and a lot of shadow in some of his more kind of like fully realized longer works. And I think that kind of echoes some of the classic horror comics, like classic black and white stuff, going back to like the 70s maybe and early 80s. Like if you think about when we talked about eerie comics actually on a previous cast, if you think about like eerie and magazines like that, and some of the black and white art that was printed there, and how oppressive and how detailed that was. And I think it's the detail that makes it claustrophobic. I don't know if you guys would agree with me on that.
Yeah, because it's like texture as well, isn't it? Because for a lot of his books, especially the ones that I've read, generally, the character faces and designs, they don't really have much shading. It's usually eyes, eyebrows, the bottom bit of the nose, and like a mouth and lips sometimes. But by doing that, there's a big focus on eyes when it comes to characters' faces and expressions, and all the other line work is meticulously used elsewhere, and often it's a weird pull, but in Ren and Stimpy, Nickelodeon's Ren and Stimpy, and they'd have a thing where it's like...
Oh, this is exactly something that I wanted to bring up, Leon, but carry on.
It may be, and it may not be, but it's the thing where that show's generally animated in a more or less flat style, but then every now and again they'll do a close-up on something, and it's always got the grossest, most hyper-detailed style for that one frame, or for that one shot that they show it for, and there's a lot of that throughout Ito's work.
It's usually something like Stimpy's butt or something, isn't it? Covered in like boils or whatever. Yeah. And it's just horrible. But like, I was going to bring that up actually, because I was going to say like what he does is, I think it's a technique that works well for the type of horror he specializes in. So it's a technique that I believe works well for body horror and some of the like the grotesque stuff that he has within his stories. So like what he does is he builds up to it, and then he does like this one this one static panel. Like he'll draw like an amazing like static panel for the end of a story. Good example of this is the end of chapter 1 of Uzumaki, which I actually thought was quite funny, where the father of Shuichi has managed to turn himself into a spiral. He bought like a special wicker basket and climbed in it, and he's managed to like bend his body into a spiral because he's realized that he can express the spiral through himself. But like the shot of him inside the basket, and it's like what he does is he builds up to it, and then he gives you that, and it's like he gives it space to breathe, and it's in an insane amount of detail, and he's basically just saying, look at this, and he gives that image space to breathe amongst the page layout and with the other panels. It's usually a larger panel, which kind of like signals to you subliminally that panel should last longer, like more time. And it sort of burns itself into your mind. It embeds itself and it burns itself into your mind, and it will be there for the rest of the book. And it will just enhance the horror and the creepiness of what comes next, because it will remain there in your head.
Flip as well.
Yeah.
So it's the you turn and then boom, it's in your face.
Boom, there it is. Yeah, because you'll get like the bottom of the page will be the other characters going, "Oh my god, what is this?" Like they're looking at it. You'll get their reactions first, then you get what they're looking at, and you always get with what they're looking at without fail. And that's what I love, because there's always a payoff. I actually get to see. I mean, as much as it's horrific to look at, it's it kind of helps the story, and it actually gives you a payoff, and it helps maintain the kind of like atmosphere throughout, I think, with the way he does that.
Yeah, I think one of the most like iconic touchstones, if I was going to express to somebody what is so great about Junji Ito, it would be that page flip thing that you mentioned, Leon. Because one thing I noticed is I read a bunch of this stuff online or on my iPad, and then a bunch of his stuff on paper. And I realized it was so much more effective for me on paper, where you have, I feel like he's very conscious, very cognizant of the fact, not just that the image he's going to reveal is on the next thing and you see it all in its, in its entirety in one go, but also like the corner of the page you're holding and the way that it's going to reveal stuff as you peel it from the bottom left to the top right. And, that whole mechanic of turning the page, I think he bears that in mind for a lot of those splash pages that he makes. And like you get to see the reveal from one corner of the page to the top of the, to the other end. And I think he's really effective of that, with that, which really puts him apart from other mangakas that I've read.
Yeah. Vicky, so how does all of this kind of sit with you?
I love just listening to what you guys are saying, because it's all stuff that I've kind of been very conscious of as I've been rereading Gyo today. But the page flip is he's so good at it. Like it is so effectively done, and the pages where you have like a full page or full 2 pages of this like very kind of striking image, very disturbing image as well. And like as you guys were talking, it's kind of like having a reread of Bakhtin. Getting back into my thesis here, but like suddenly this image popped into my head of like what's her name, Kaori from Gyo, like just floating in the air like on the little mechanical legs and stuff like that. And I was just like, and her body is so bloated, and that image I just can't get it out of my head. And it's so effective, and it just reminded me of like Bakhtin's like definition of the grotesque and carnivalesque, which is like the senile pregnant hag. And that image for me is it's so ridiculous, and yet for some reason it's so effective in terms of like horror, and it's something that like I feel like will seep into my nightmares kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's actually like something else I was going to bring up, because he kind of straddles the line between comedy and horror very well, doesn't he?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's so like so many of the things, like just like I'm so grossed out by this that you can't help but laugh. It's such a funny reaction, because I don't know that I've had that reaction to many other horror texts or like even films or anything. I'm struggling to think of anything. It'll come to me later, but it's very effective.
Well, I think the nearest touchstone that I can think of in film is Sam Raimi, who does like the horror comedy thing really well. But I think Sam Raimi uses the comedy as like deliberate relief in a lot of ways, where I think the way I feel about Junji Ito stuff is that it's comic in a way to trick you into like what's the word I'm looking for? Submissiveness, so that you're then ready to be shocked again on the next page. And I feel like it oscillates between horror and comedy a lot, where it's like in a disarming way, and like if anything, you're like opening yourself up to more horror because he's tricked you into laughing as opposed to wanting you to laugh, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it's even downright to like down to the downright ridiculousness of the overall concepts. Like Vicky was mentioning the in Gyo, the bloated bodies, like with the legs and the gas, like these giant these people that are just turned into rotting balloons effectively that power these mechanical legs. And like just the ridiculous image of this like bloated body, like full of tubes, like something from, I don't know, like a Tool music video or something. I don't know, like, and there it is. And it's just like the whole kind of like ridiculousness of that concept. So, like fish with legs, like the idea of fish with legs, like the concept of a shark walking on land alone, or, yeah,
it is so ridiculous, and it's so funny. But you see, like in Gyo, where they go to the circus, that's just like for me. I think my husband was saying that like he wasn't sure about that part because he thought it was a little bit too ridiculous, and I was like, I love that he's leaning into that kind of very actually neatly carnivalesque like layer of this narrative where, like who thinks up this stuff? It was so left field for me that I was just like, I don't know how your mind works, but I love it. And like the cannon with like, shooting out all the bloated people, I was like, this is so gross, but I love it so much.
I think this is because he does gag manga as well. So he's had before, like, so he did horror. So he does like funny gag manga as well. So he kind of like blurs the lines between the two.
I didn't know that, but that makes so much sense.
Yeah, because like I think the gag manga informs the horror in some of his stuff, and that kind of like he's like kind of blurring the lines between horror and comedy a lot, and that actually is really, really evident in the Cat Diary. So
I love the Cat Diary. I think that might be my favorite thing. It is so funny, and it's just the way he draws his fiance, and how like midway through he has to like draw her better because she like complained. It's just so. There's something so genius about it, and the thing is, like the horror is actually it's so everyday that it leans into like the uncanny in such a way that it's just basically reality, like dialed a little bit off kilter.
Yeah.
With the cat with the skull on its back. I couldn't stop laughing because so much of it is so real, and cats are terrible anyway. And I was looking at my cat and I was just like, you do have superhuman strength. When they want something, it's so real. And yet at the same time, it's so effective as a horror narrative.
Yeah, I mean, the superhuman strength thing, I remember my cats when I lived at the previous place before I'm where I am now. We had like a cupboard that had like slats. It was like a ventilated cupboard, and that was like kind of like a pantry / store cupboard in the kitchen. And that's where we used to keep the cat food, and they had worked out how to open that. And I used to put stuff in front of it to stop them, but they still somehow managed to open it. They would like pry it open slightly and then get their bodies into the gap and push and like use their superhuman cat strength to get into the food cupboard.
They do that. And it's so like every single panel that he drew in the cat diary, I could relate to, because I was like, oh, done that. Desi's done that. Oh, yep, absolutely. Just like the whole like getting to the wall, the whole like Blair Witch thing where they just sit and they look at the wall and you're like, what are you looking at?
Yeah.
What is this? Like, what is it? What could you possibly be looking at? Like
what do you know that we don't?
Yeah, exactly. And it's that I love when he just like describes, is it Jan with the accursed face?
Yeah.
Yeah, where he's just like this cat, like I don't like its face, and I was just looking at the drawings, and I was just like, oh, there is something cosmic and evil about this cat, isn't there?
It's because like its face is very human.
It is. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah,
Again, cats. It's that blurring of boundaries.
Yeah, cats with people faces. But it's like it's these warped, detailed faces that he does, and the features of like on these faces, like so the way that he plays this book, and the thing that I really like about it is it's like his fiance is kind of like inducting him into some kind of weird cult of cats, and it's kind of all happening around him, and he has no say or control over what's happening in the world around him. Like it's his brand new house, and then all of a sudden there's things stuck to the wall to prevent the cats from destroying the walls. And, like all of a sudden extra pieces of furniture and toys are appearing and things like that. And he has no control over any of it. He's just waking up in this world that's just warping around him. And it's the strange shapes and the movements, and like in moments of delirium when he actually gives in to the changing of the world and decides to just give in and just be with it. Like when he's like expressing love towards the cats or whatever, these moments of delirium where they have like these single panels of his face, like in like this crazed kind of like moment of, it's like happiness, but it's so warped and crazed. And it's like he's trying to communicate the warping and changing of this world and this reality through the cats. And like he's an initiate, like I was saying, like he's an initiate to a supernatural cult, and his wife is like his pupilless guide. And that was the thing she got annoyed about, wasn't it? Because that was in the question and answer thing. She didn't like that he drew her without pupils.
It's so funny though, because you're absolutely right. I didn't think about it as like in terms of a cult, but she does actually look like a cult leader when she's got like the pupilless eyes and that kind of like smirk on her face, where she's just like, this cat will only like suckle my thumb, or like, it's just, and then he gets so jealous about it as well. And like, so I just love those moments. You're right, of like total delirium where he's like, love me.
Yeah, exactly, grabbing the cat.
So yeah,
and the bit where she gets jealous, his wife gets jealous when the cat loves him, and she grabs the other cat, and there's like 3-panel breakdown of her grabbing this cat, like pulling the cat, and the cat holding on the carpet for dear life because it doesn't want to be picked up. And I'm like, I know what that is.
Oh yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. Any cat owner could relate. It's so relatable. I just that's what. If you have ever interacted with a cat, I feel like you can read Junji Ito's cat diary and be like, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Cats are evil. Cats do know something that we don't. They are definitely related to some kind of weird, like, Lovecraftian horror thing. I just love it. It's so effective.
Yeah, and there is this, again, there's escalation there, because things get weirder and weirder and worse and bigger as it goes along. Like, more things appear in the house, and you go from 1 cat to 2 cats, and then like he goes to his like mother, his like in-laws house, and they've got a cat that never shows itself to anyone. That's just like some kind of like poltergeist almost, isn't it?
Yeah, I love that because I had totally when I was rereading, and the whole the incident with the fake poo where he throws it and then it turns out to be like puke, and it's just it's so grotesque but so funny and completely relatable. Like I've been saying, is just like if you know a cat, you have seen the look that he draws so well, because like the cats are so expressive in this kind of like dead-eyed way. Like they never actually like, you know, it's not like a smile or anything. It's just like a look in their eye where you're just like, what are you thinking? Are you? Are
it's
you
like
gonna
everything.
murder me?
It's like the people as well. The people are like leaning more towards the cartoon side of the spectrum in that comic, and the cats are drawn very hyper realistically sometimes.
They are, especially in terms of like expression, where you can like when they sneeze and you're just like, you can feel like the spray.
I think it's Moo that he draws especially, with like the really like hyper real fur.
It's
and
so
everything
funny.
else. Yeah,
like the Norwegian forest cat, where you can just tell that this is you can tell how much he loves the cats though through like how he's drawn them.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like really endearing at the end of the day, and really heartwarming to read.
It is.
But see, I've not read much of this book. I've read like clips of it online, and when I've done some research and whatever. But it strikes me as one of those books that, depending on where you're coming at it from to begin with, it's either like a really relatable, affectionate description of what it's like to be a cat owner, or if you're not a cat person, like I'm not, it's like an affirmation of all of the things you dislike about an animal. It sounds like it reads both ways depending on which way you're looking at it from.
Yeah, I can see that, definitely, yeah. And the other thing with it as well, it's so this is when obviously the reason I've got onto this and talking about this is because of the gag manga thing, because this is effectively, at the end of the day, a gag manga. It's not really a horror story, is it? I would say this is like him showing his comedy chops with this one. And also, again, but like in reverse of what he does in his other works, where he, like, probably 2 parts horror, 1 part comedy. With this, it's 2 parts comedy, 1 part horror.
Yes. I mean, I don't know anything about gag comedy, but I'm just flipping through it, and you know that panel is like he's caught the cat, and he's just got this like elongated, uncanny face, and in the background, his fiance's got the same like expression with like the pupilless eyes.
Yeah,
it's so funny because it is so like horror based. And I can't stop laughing at this because it's just it's very sweet, but at the same time, like I can totally see where you're coming from, Ray, with being completely put off cats now after reading this, because it just affirms your worst nightmares. And cats are a nightmarish creature,
especially the amount of page space that gets devoted to the fact that poop gets stuck in Moo's fur.
That's awful, man. I mean, so this seems like a good time to bring up a quote that I found by Junji Ito, which is the way he draws his comics, the way he like makes his stories, is that he takes something normal and looks at it backwards. And I feel like that's, like you were saying, 2 parts comedy, 1 part horror is a good way to describe like the living situation of having to live with like an alien entity, which is what cats feel like to me sometimes.
Yeah. And that's kind of like the fact that he takes, this is like the thing I wanted to get at as well. Like I've been like a theme through his work, because I've been trying to pick out overarching themes for us to discuss, I guess. But the thing that like he does so well is he takes something very ordinary and mundane, and then he turns it into something like he takes it through the mirror, like you say, he looks at it backwards and he turns it into something weird and horrifying. And like, again, with Uzumaki, with just a simple shape, a spiral, like, but that goes from like the way he transitions from psychological horror to body horror, to go back to Uzumaki again. And the way he does this in a lot of his stories, like, in Amigara Fault as well, it's like it transitions from something that's purely psychological and cosmic to something that is actually, you know, physical and just goes into body horror, doesn't it? So, I mean, if we look at the example in Uzumaki where he does that, it's the fact, again, in the first chapter, with the almost religious obsession with spirals, that, like, almost like it's a cult or a religion. Like he's, you know, an initiate into a religion, and he's learning and becoming like a high priest. And then all of a sudden it becomes body horror when he learns how to twist his own body into the spiral shape. And again, with, Amigara Fault, where it starts off very, very psychological with the draw of the fault in the mountain and the human-shaped holes, and then becomes body horror when people actually enter the holes, become trapped in the holes, and end up getting warped by, you know, the changing shape of the holes, kind of thing.
Yeah, I really like that kind of, as you were saying, like people get kind of drawn, like in the Enigma of Amigara Fault, where they get drawn back into the holes and stuff, and that pull, I think, is so interesting, because it's almost like all these stories are inevitable.
Yeah.
Like they could never end any other way. Actually, and I think with Uzumaki, with the whole concept of like a spiral, how it just, you know, it kind of collapses in on itself, like, and the way the story ends as well, it almost feels like that the whole thing was kind of preordained in this way, and there's no way around it. Like all people are driven mad by it because they know that the way that it's always going to end up.
Like every so many hundreds of years, the whole town turns into a spiral, and then everyone else becomes a spiral, and then they all get dumped into this big spiral hell, and then that's it.
Yeah, like no end, no beginning, you know, like you can't, like the origin is so far removed from like what's happening now. It's been like this for, like, you know, since time began almost, and everything's just kind of arrested in this like little in a spiral of history of repeating itself, and that to me is like it's peak Freud almost, like where it gets into the uncanny, and like in exactly what Freud speaks about being uncanny is this like compulsion towards repetition that you can't get away from, and this need to just like have a repeat pattern of the way that things, like in how things unfold. I'm not voicing that very well, but
it's like the Freudian death drive as well, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I guess that like inevitable,
like pilgrimage to destruction is the way is what I've put, because that's the thing with Amigara Fault. So like I wanted to touch on two things you just said. So like with Uzumaki, which I haven't read, but it sounds like with Amigara Fault, it starts off with like an earthquake which splits open this mountain, and you find out that these holes are like hidden in nature, like they were already there, they were lying in wait, and it's about these things that are hiding naturally in the natural world, just waiting to be uncovered. And like I feel like there's a lot of that in his stories.
Yeah, and
just to think, because like there's the thing with, because there's a lot of, as we've discussed, there's a lot of similarities in theming with Uzumaki and the Enigma of Amigara Fault. And one of them is like, you have this weird irony of like finding where you belong, but where you belong is terrifying. And with like Amigara Fault, they've caught glimpses of holes shaped like them, and it's like, it's kind of it would be impossible to be like, oh yeah, that looks like my shape, because I don't even know what my shape would be. But this is it's a like nature's cosmic terror, where it's just a click, you know, like just intuition. Like you see it, and it'd be like, because I don't know how I'd initially react if, like, say I was on the tube or something, and then across the platform I saw my doppelganger or something like that, and if I would immediately recognize, oh, that person looks exactly like me, or if it's like I don't see myself how the world sees me. But it is like this thing of like, oh, that's home, and you just have this drive and pull. And with I've read the story a million times, but I can't remember her name. But the lady that the lead character bumps into on the way there, and for him, that stuff's manifested in like nightmares that he's having, which also end up being semi exposition dumps for us, but in quite an organic way. But then for her, it's just a case of like, she's gone there because she's seen her like human hole on TV and she's been drawn to it. But then there's this whole like reticence where it's like not an activity of like I'm going to go to that hole and walk in because blah blah, like some of the people are, where they've just been like, this is my one, and they jump in. With her, it's like, I'm going to end up in there. It's going to pull me in. It's going to pull me in. It's going to pull me in. Don't leave me alone. It's going to pull me in.
Yeah, she's terrified of the prospect, and there's like a hook in her mind dragging her to it.
Yeah, like there's passivity in that, where it's like you're getting so close to the void and glimpsing over enough that she's found her shape, her hole, that it becomes a thing of like just impending doom. It's like it's not a case of if, it's a case of when. And I think that's a thing that just goes through all of Ito's works, where it's just horrible loops of like obsession and compulsion, and these like I was mentioning before, the intrusive thoughts that just start off as a whisper and then before long become like a chorus just blaring in your head.
Yeah, it gets so loud you can't ignore it. Like it really does. Like you took the words out of my mouth, really, because what I was going to say is that it touches on like obsessive compulsive disorder, like OCD, like especially with the guy collecting spirals and worshipping, obsessing over spirals. And again, you know, it's like this OCD compulsion to see if you fit in the hole kind of thing, you know. It's like,
the awful thing about Amigara Fault is it's like she has that whole lead up to getting into the hole, but then it's the moment where you've gone into the hole, there's no turning back, you've made that one single choice, and then you're inexorably dragged down the path, but it takes a month. And like you're trying to find out where you belong, and it turns out like a month later where you belong is in like a bolognese sauce. Like it's that concept of you make this choice and then it still takes forever for the repercussions to come around.
Yeah,
that idea is horrible.
And to bring this again back to Uzumaki, speaking of spaghetti,
right?
There's this bit. It's like my favorite chapter actually. It's where the you know, the long houses, where everyone's inside the long houses and they squish themselves in so hard. And they all cram into these long houses, like in such a like extreme way that they all become spaghetti. And then when the house falls down around them, when the houses break and they start, they are just like, you know, like when you let spaghetti go cold in the pan, and it becomes like this like congealed like block of spaghetti. They look like that, and that's just like a weird note that I had just to do with that when you brought up spaghetti. Because I thought that was brilliant and also weirdly hilarious. But
the niche genre of like Tupperware horror.
I love it, but I love that you brought up the parallel in Uzumaki to like the houses, because for me, like the Enigma of Amigara Fault, it feels almost like when they go into the holes, it's like the sense of like going home.
Yeah,
and like this draw, and the reason why she's so scared of like going back in the hole is like it's this like return almost to like some kind of primeval idea of home that like is so terrifying that she like can't bring herself to do it, but she's drawn to it, and like she has to just, in the end it like consumes her and she ends up in the hole anyway. But like it's just there's something so terrifying about that idea of like this compulsion to return to like your original source or some kind of like a point of origin kind of thing that I find
exactly
really
yeah. Like read Amigara Fault and then try and, you know, like those children's toys with, you know, you have to put shapes in holes.
Oh yes. Yeah, I never thought about it that way, but yeah, no, I'm never going to be able to do it now.
Like that, the first thing that comes into my head is that, or you know, the Play-Doh toys.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, the Play-Doh.
Yeah,
the extrusion machine thing.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like that's almost as if he was looking at one of those when he wrote it, like one of those Play-Doh toys. But yeah, no, I can. Yeah, I fully do love that story, and definitely draw parallels with that, and parallels with I suppose between Uzumaki and Gyo is the theme of escalation, which is something I keep bringing up. But yeah, it's how it kind of just like goes on an upwards curve, and the curve just gets sharper and steeper as it goes. Like it goes from, I think what I was going to say actually is to do with one of the, like my favorite scene in Gyo actually one of my favorite scenes in Gyo, one of my favorite pages, or parts is the part with the, the plastic bag where he wraps the fish creature that he believes he's killed in the plastic bag, and then the bag starts floating and following him. Yeah,
this is one of those points that I see. I brought this up in my notes for let me see, threats that you can't comprehend and that make you pause with confused, absurd comedy. Like I've noticed, this is the thing about oscillating between horror and comedy. I think Gyo does this really well, because I've got notes like listing what's happening in the through the story just so I can keep track of what's going on. And then every so often I've written stuff in capital letters to show like the shock comedy moments. So I was like, all the pacing, look how creepy the spindly legs are, look how scared the fish monster is. And then like towards the end it's like, it follows, but with a gross, unnatural floating crab bag. Or, first we had a shark on legs and then here come the cephalopods. Like there's always this moment where everything becomes so absurd that it becomes funny, and then it drops back into horror, and then it like escalates, gives you a sense of relief, and then shows you more horror. And like, it's that thing of, if it was drawn as a graph, it would be going up and then only dropping slightly, and then you'd still, overall, the trend would be escalation. But you're constantly doing this like curve up and down.
And the whale, when the whale comes out of the ocean and just collapses under its own weight.
And it can't quite be supported by the mechanical legs, which I never fully explained, but I like the fact that they came from something that clearly wasn't man-made.
They hint at the fact that those mechanical legs were actually built by the bacteria, don't they?
Mm.
And from like old shipwrecks and stuff.
Yeah, and I like that this story, Gyo in particular, doesn't fully commit to like what the intentionality of the machines, or like the intentionality of the gas, or the symbiote things which connect to a dying body which has been inflicted by this disease, which makes them, spit out this putrid gas, which then powers the machines themselves. Like it never fully explains what the root of that is, whether it's cosmic, whether it's like it's come from Earth somewhere deep in the ocean, or whether it was potentially man-made. But towards the end of the story, they hint that it can't have been man-made. There were no joins, there were no seams. It seems organic, but masquerading as like sterile, and it's this horrible thing.
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at it is that it's just one massively elaborate fart gag.
And there's a lot of that as well. Like one of my favorite horror comedies, sort of like it's so disgusting and disarming that it makes you laugh, is like when you find out she's tried to commit suicide, but she's like farting and burping this gas at the same time. She's kind of spinning on the rope because of
around the room.
Yeah, because of the force of the gases. And it's like, it's horrifying. And if you were there in that room, you'd be struck still by the awfulness of what you're seeing. But on page, it's kind of funny, and it takes a lot for me to feel this, but I felt bad for laughing.
Yeah,
I felt bad. It's awful.
But when you think about it as well, like when you think about the bit at the beginning with the floating plastic bag, like why wouldn't it end in a blimp?
Well, yes. So that's one of my notes is escalation, a fucked up dirigible, and then the next one is swerve, the dirigible has bat wings. Like even when you think it's as stupid as it can get, it gets stupider. But in a really fun and entertaining and sort of like enabling the more horrific aspects way.
Yeah. Oh dear. No, yeah, it's one of those things that when you're reading it, it's the frightening aspect is there, but when you think back about it, it's actually really funny. It's like, this blimp that's powered by this like really noxious gas. And it's,
one point that I thought was really effective, that isn't one of the big moments, is like, well, it kind of is to spoil towards the end of Gyo, where like our protagonist ends up in the death circus and they ignite the gas, and it sort of reveals that this dream he had where it was potentially paranormal, but then they backpedal to show that it's this very organic, natural thing. It's just the gas that is being created by this disease. they ignite the gas and then you can see the faces. Like that's what it takes to see the face that's driving the gas. And it reminded me of seeing people vape on the street. So like, you know, when you, it's that moment where I think I brought this up a couple of times on the cast, but like where you realize that the smoke vape, the walls and the motion of the vapor, this visible vapor, are the same as the invisible air that we breathe. It's just that we can see it because it's you know, it's an opaque vapor, and we're constantly walking through the fog of other people's exhalations. And like, if you realize that the entire world is made up of this by the end, and it's like suffused with this unnatural, disgusting gas, like that's the moment it really hit home for me. I was like, shit, we could be living this right now. We just can't see it, you know? And and the artwork for this is great because like it slowly does escalate from the start to the end of the book, where he's constantly drawing in like the haze of the gas that's been introduced into the world. And like it's so like slow building that you almost don't notice it until halfway through.
Yeah.
I thought that was really effective.
It also makes me think of a story from my childhood when I was like really, really little. We used to have a tin cupboard at my mum's house with like lots of like tin fish and all sorts of other stuff. And me being me, used to mess around with the tins. And some of those tins had keys on, especially the fish ones. Like kipper tins with keys on and stuff. And like I was there one day building forts with these tins or something, and my mum was like, she could see me like looking at the key on this can of kippers or whatever, like telling me not to play with it. And obviously, you know, I'm not going to listen to her because I'm 3 years old. And I opened the tin and got the juice all over my hands. And I just remember it being this incredibly traumatic experience because my hands just smelled like fish for the rest of the night, no matter how many times I washed them. And I was just like, get it off, you know, couldn't get it off. And just like when I was reading Go, like the fact that this like rotten fish smell just like all across the island or whatever, and this smell that hit, is it Kaori?
Yeah, Kaori.
Kaori, yeah. The smell that Kaori's complaining about. And I just thought back to that moment when I was a kid, just sitting there with like smelly fish hands, like crying because no matter how many times I washed my hands, I couldn't get rid of the smell.
That is horrid. Nothing in this book really made me gag, but that story did.
Yeah. That's what you get though when you don't listen, isn't it?
It's funny that like it's the smell though that like is particularly gag worthy, because like it's one of those things like where in horror, like I can't really think of anything other than this and like the yellow wallpaper where like the protagonist is like, oh, and it was like a yellow smell and the smell drives her like insane, where it's that like olfactory sense that's particularly offensive.
Yeah.
And it's quite memorable because like I think like, you know, studies have shown that like in terms of like conjuring memories, like when you think back to like certain smells, they're like the strongest associations like with very particularly like in-depth memories. So hence your fishy hands story works really well there. But it just like, I guess like just picturing like what it must smell like, I think is one of the most horrific things about that story, because you're just like, it must just smell like a fish market times 1,000. like the like dying. But yeah, no, it's just it's the idea of the smell that really gets me, because it's what drives her insane in the end, right? Is like Kaori's like, it still smells in here, and she can't get it. She can't get it out of her head, like that smell. There's something particularly just like ridiculous but terrifying about that idea of smell following you around.
And then she becomes the source of the smell.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And you could tell that he was having fun, like drawing different configurations for the legs in in that book, like with like one of them that's basically just a pile of bodies that just collects people.
Yes.
Like later on in the book, yeah.
Did anyone else get like a War of the Worlds kind of vibe though from the story?
Yeah,
a little, yeah. Especially with the way it's like little spindly legs. Like,
yes, and like and just the whole like mechanical aspect of like of this threat. But like I just thought it was so interesting that like it's something that, you know, is alive because of some kind of like horrid corruption of bacteria, and like in War of the Worlds, it's the bacteria that kills the aliens, and so it was just kind of like subverting that trope of like how do we defeat the monsters, but the monsters are homegrown kind of thing that really taps into kind of like that 1950s fear of like they were amongst us all along kind of thing.
Yeah.
It came from the deep sea, and I thought that was really I loved that aspect of it.
Yeah, especially like the slow building of scale, because it starts off with small fish and then it escalates to like sharks on legs and then it escalates to whales on legs. And then it's ultimately builds up to the end of the story where it's very reminiscent of War of the Worlds. That's one of the things I thought of, where it's like you see in the haze in the background, like in the distance, these massive spindly creatures which have hundreds of human bodies attached to them. They're like feeding off the gases of multiple bodies at the same time. And I like that the story ends on that note. Like it ends in a way that I didn't expect, because it's basically like it becomes apocalyptic, but the story ends because Kaori's now at peace. Like her body has finally been burned and she no longer has the stench that she was afraid of at the very start of the book. And like, that's how the story is bookended. I thought was quite tragic and affecting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it, like with this book particularly, with Go particularly, of the ones I read, the way that he draws like decomposing things. So if you have a look at the way that he draws corpses and the way that he draws these like hyper detailed decomposing bodies attached to these like leg things that are walking and stuff, and then you look through some of his other work, like this is going to be a weird thing to say, but I love the way he draws corpses. Like, he's really, really good at drawing, like, decomposing, like, rotting flesh and getting that, like, mottledness on it and the amount of, like, detail that he puts in there and stuff. And that's actually really evident in his adaptation of Frankenstein. So when I was reading through his adaptation of Frankenstein, I thought the book itself was, like, absolutely beautiful, like, in the way that he draws, like, Frankenstein's monster. And the way that he draws the dead bodies when Dr. Frankenstein goes grave robbing and stuff. And it's just like, it's a really weird thing to say, but the way he draws these like grotesque, like the way he gets that spot on, or almost spot on for me, like, I think that's fantastic. Like in the way that he manages to get that amount of detail in, and it actually produces a reaction from you, because you look at it and it's not like when you look at other comics or you know, or with zombies or anything like that. It's like you look at it and it's because of the staticness of the panel as well, because again, it's left there to linger. You look at it and you get like the whole like, ew, kind of, you actually recoil from it because you're looking at it in such detail, and it really is truly grotesque. And like this whole like thing with rotten flesh, and then to do that to the extent that he did it in Kyo, with like every other thing on the page was rotten or, you know, exploding with this weird gas or full of like boils or whatever. It's just insane. I loved it.
My reaction to this sort of like organic horror, I don't know if any of you guys had this, but like, because I spent a good part of my week coming home and reading Junji Ito, and I found that I couldn't take too much of it in big doses, so I spent a lot of time in between playing Tetris or playing with some Lego, because I feel like after all that disgusting organic corruption of bodies, I needed something that was really straight-edged and sharp and clinical and clean. Did anybody else have that reaction?
No, not really. Not in that way. Like, I would go from this to something like, I don't know, like I would just read another comic. But not necessarily another comic that was ordered or straight, or actually, you know what? Actually, yeah, I did, because I went from this to shiny superhero comics. So I guess there's the point there, because I would read this and then I would go and read X-Men or something, and it was just like completely juxtaposed, like two very different kinds of comic, very different kinds of sequential art as well, and also like the because obviously one is Japanese and you would read it, I guess, I mean, the way I would say you would read it would be back to front, but that's wrong, because in Japan that is the front. But like, it's like going from reading one way to reading the other. So I'm like swiping one way on my tablet, then swiping the other, or, you know, reading one way and then reading the other. And it's like the kind of, I think I messed myself up a little bit doing that, but Yeah. Like flipping backwards and forwards.
Yeah, I
Or
think that
forwards
might
and
be
forwards, as it were.
I realize that might be the wrong question to ask for like the horror aficionados and the Gothic literature student. But like if you need a palpable sense of relief from this kind of stuff, like how do you go about doing it? But yeah.
Yeah, I mean you're talking to like me, Ray. And you know that I just basically spend my life immersed in stuff like this. So
yeah, Vicky, how do you feel about that?
Well, I was reading it before bed. So, like, this clearly doesn't get under my skin in the same way that some other things do. I was having very strange dreams afterwards. Like, nothing that I can really kind of bring up in a podcast because it's not for polite company. But yeah, no, it's just, I do spend a lot of time thinking about it though, because it doesn't like affect me in the sense that like, I'm not scared, but I spend a lot of time just being like, why do I like this so much? You know what I mean? Like, it's because I'm not really a comic person, and I don't read a lot of graphic, respond to manga either, but for some reason I just love Junji Ito, and it's been a couple of years now where I think like the Enigma of Amigara Fault was the first thing that I read, and at first I was like, this is so ridiculous, like, what is this? What did I just read? And then I couldn't stop thinking about it, and a couple days later I was kind of scared me, and I don't have that reaction a lot things that I watch on a regular basis, but yeah, no, there's something very special about Junji Ito where whenever he releases on, I'm like, I need to buy this needs to go in the collection, we need to have this like on our shelf, and then people come over and they're just like, what is this?
Yeah, it's because it is so unique, I suppose, in terms of the way that he does things and the way his horror is. It's like, I mean, like to go back to what you were saying, Ray, about like things getting under your skin, or to go back to what Vicky was saying even about things getting under your skin. Like when I have this reaction where when I watch things, or if something does get under my skin, it doesn't frighten me right away, but it is afterwards when I am alone or like lying in bed or whatever that I start to think about it more, and then that's when it starts to get under my skin. So my initial reaction to it will probably be like really neutral, but then afterwards it will play on my mind.
To be clear, it's not that I'm scared of it. It's not that it's necessarily getting under my skin. It's just like after you've had like, 6 biscuits in a row, you sometimes just need a bit of a glass of water or something just to wash it down, or to like take a break from it. But to what you were saying, Vicky, I think part of the reason Junji Ito's like a good starting point for people new to comics is like, one, it's very concept driven. So like, I think most people can just enjoy a really interesting, unique, simple concept delivered very like starkly. I think Amigara Fault is a really good example of why a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily read comics have found that, because the images are so like indelible and mimetic, and they've spread across the internet. And so you would have exposure to them where you wouldn't normally. But also, I think his comics don't necessarily ask for a lot of comic literacy. I think you don't need to have read lots of comics to understand how to read his comics. And so I think they're very easy to get into, especially because like horror tends to be that, I think, because everyone's afraid of something. So there's always something to capture your imagination that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know. I feel like, horror is one of the off a lot, especially like, like the way movies are kind of rewarded during award season. Like, I feel like no one really thinks about horror, and with like Jordan Peele now, I think people are starting to realize that it can be quite cerebral. And I find that like, as weird and kind of and grim as Ito stuff is, like it really sticks with you. And just like I feel like I haven't really like thought about this at great length, but there's probably some kind of social message there with a lot of the stories as well, like with Greased and like the poor family like living in the same shop, like in close proximity to like where meals are cooked, and like just that like kind of awful glyceride seeping into their skin and stuff like that. Like that to me, like kind of, I don't know, works quite well on like almost like a Parasite level, like where it's like about like where people live when they're disenfranchised, and the horrors of being there, I guess. I don't know. like I said, like I haven't thought a great length about this, but I do. I find that his stories just hit a nerve with me, in a way that not a lot of other stuff does. Where I'm like compelled to read more.
Yeah, and like I think there's probably like a bit of an environmental message with Gil actually when I think about it. Like, yes,
absolutely. Yeah. I think that in terms of eco-gothic is kind of like a big thing now, you know, with kind of this weird like Mother Nature is turning on us kind of thing, because it's a hot topic like every day, right? Is how much we're destroying the planet and how much this is going to bite us in the ass, and how much it's already kind of affected the world and stuff. So I think you're absolutely right, and it's something that I've been meaning to read more on. But I like that that's the crux of Gyo.
Yeah, see, I did, like you're saying, I didn't spend too much time thinking about what the social aspects could mean, but I've got a few notes on Gyo. So, like, I've got the march of human progress in service of destruction, because you've got this idea of the original C device, which was possibly formed organically by the disease, versus the steel contraption that is, you know, impenetrable to rust and corruption that Dr. Koyanagi made. And like, that's taking something that is already destructive and making a stronger man-made version of it. And then following that, like how the system, like the machine that these bodies are strapped into, like how that is changed, you know, how that changes our organically driven dance. Because the original machines that came from the sea are doing one thing and you can't ascribe too much intentionality to them. But then when Dr. Koyanagi makes a version of it and he straps himself into it, it follows a different rhythm, it follows a different pattern, and there's something really like evil about that. And then I think the final one was, I've just got a question saying, is it a direct response to climate change? Because it came out around 2001, 2002, and I think Leon might have something more to say on this. You left a note for me.
Yeah, I just think that I thought it was a good point with that, because you were marking like the release of this, and like climate change, or back then global warming, there's always been a topic that bubbles up and down, but like in this period of time, it's really close to the Kyoto Protocol being like signed in, and in the midst of it coming into action a couple of years later. So I think this was a sort of eclipse time when these worries were back in the zeitgeist to some degree.
Yeah, because I think the thing that I went searching for straight after I realized it came out in 2001, 2002 was to see when like An Inconvenient Truth came out, which I think was 2006, 2005, sometime around in that same decade, you know.
And the more that I read things like this or see, you know, this kind of movie, the greater appreciation I have for The Happening. Even though I've probably sat and trashed The Happening on this very cast, like as a film, because I mean, when I remember going to see it, and my initial reaction to it being, this is terrible. But like the more like of this type of story I read, and the more that I explore like Junji Ito's style of horror and whatever, the more of an appreciation I have for The Happening, the film, and maybe actually it's not that such a bad film.
I'll push back on that, because I think what you're getting at there is that the concept is like right, and it's a fruitful concept that you could do a lot of interesting things with, but that movie doesn't really.
It was executed poorly.
Yeah.
Executed very poorly, yeah. But, you know, it was ahead of its time, I guess.
Yeah, and concept only, though. But in execution, it's so ridiculous that it's almost like a piss take of climate change, where you're just like, you couldn't hit the nail harder on the head in a way that would put climate change deniers, like, you know, on high alert, being like, this is nothing. It almost is the opposite of what it's trying to do. Because it is so bad. I don't think I've trashed this film with you guys, but just, you know, if we had time on this podcast, it is, I think, probably the worst time I've ever had at the cinema.
I went to the cinema to see it, and all I'm going to say is I wanted my time back, because I remember the Hulk movie came out at the same time as that. A Hulk movie came out, And I did like a double feature thing because I went to see that and then I went and did something else for half an hour and then went back to watch the Hulk like straight after. It's like a palate cleanser.
Well, all I know is I'd love to do an M. Night Shyamalan with you guys at some point.
I love that. Can we please?
Yes.
Because I don't know if you guys have watched Servant, but I have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, me too.
On Scary Jerry.
Well, okay, so I spent more of my time reading a lot of the short stories, so I just wanted to point out two that I found really effective. So one was Red Turtleneck. Did anyone else read that one? About a guy who's basically holding his decapitated head against his body, and if he lets go, he'll die.
Oh, yeah, no, I didn't read it, but it was one of the ones that came up in some of the stuff that I'd read around the subject in preparation. So, in fact, actually, I read like a sort of like listicle about some of the most like horrifying panels from his work, and that pops up.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Like, I mean, sorry, I've just lost track of my notes, but one of the things
decapitated like very deliberately and in such a kind of like surgical way that he's still alive, and if his grip isn't that good, then obviously, you know, he's going to die.
But there's this like agonizing escalation to the concept. Like, it's already awful to begin with, and like some of the first few pages of that comic are colored in, and you realize that it's called Red Turtleneck because he's just been given a turtleneck that's like made out of white cotton, but it's turned red because all the blood is seeping out of his neck, and it slowly fades from red to white as it goes further down. And so he's holding his head, and then it gets to this point where like the antagonist, she's just messing with him, and in the same way that Junji Ito is messing with us, because he's already shown us this really horrific, like awful concept, and then she takes like a playing card and swipes it into the wound, and then further escalates it by like pushing a cockroach into it, and he's screaming, and like while they're trying to figure out what to do, he has to like, the only way he can get rid of it without taking his head off is to swallow it. And that just, I had to put it down for a second to think, because that was, it hit me way too viscerally, that comic, and that's why I put it down as one of my favorites. And then there was also one called The Hanging Balloons, which as a concept is so paranormal, so surreal that, I don't know, it came full circle into being like iconic and really affecting, where it's basically every single person has a giant version of their head floating in the sky with a noose hanging from it, and it follows you around and tries to capture your real head in its noose, and then you're gone. And like,
yes. I remember this one.
It's such a great concept, and especially how the mechanic of that is then built upon throughout a relatively short comic. I think it's only like 30 pages, but like how much he packs in, how much like mechanical, like narratively mechanical swerves he puts into that story is amazing. I think that's one of my favorites. Yeah,
I mean, actually, one of the other short stories that I read, the short, I think it's an adaptation of somebody else's story, was The Human Chair. I'm just bringing up some information on it now because I believe that it is an adaptation of. Yeah, it's a short story by Japanese author and critic Edogawa Rampo, and it was originally published in October 1925, but it was adapted as a movie in 1997, and then it was adapted into a manga by Junji Ito. And this is the story of a carpenter who builds himself into a chair so that he can be like, it's like really, really creepy because I mean, if you look at the reveal panel where it shows you the inside of the chair, he's like built himself into a chair so that he is forever with his favorite author or something. Like, so when the author sits in the chair, he's like constantly embracing her because his arms are in the arm of the chair and he's sitting in the chair. And that really got under my skin, actually, when I think about it. That was like my cockroach in the neck moment, I think. Like the idea of someone living inside a chair, like completely unknown to you. Like they come out at night and stretch their legs and get something to eat or whatever. But then they go back into the chair. Like as if they are part of the chair. You know,
it's like those stories of like somebody hiding in your attic and you don't know for like years and years and years, right?
Yeah, but like even worse because they're in your chair. Like imagine you sit at this like really plush armchair on your computer, but there's someone living in that. Like breathing heavily because they're getting to kind of like almost touch you.
I hate that. That is, stop it.
Yeah. Exactly.
Nothing has really creeped me out. And now I'm just like, I don't want to sit in my chair anymore. Don't want to be here. No,
exactly. That's exactly why it got under my skin, because it's just like the weirdest, creepiest concept ever.
But like the work, because I've seen that, I haven't read the comic, but I've seen the image that's been spread around the internet, and like it's like the back of this leather armchair is opened up, and it has space for his face, arms, and legs to be like folded into the sofa. But the worst bit is like next to his head, there's little shelves, and one of them has like a tin of beans on it or something. It's like, so was he eating the tin of beans while sat in the chair? Like imagine somebody's head chomping cold beans from a tin.
Oh,
while you're sat like on top of him, like mere centimeters away. That's just creeps me out.
The worst part, if you look closely, is the fact that because he's obviously been in there, like sweating and everything, right? and you've got like the print of his skull on the inside of the face bit. If you have a look,
oh, that's nasty, dude.
It's like whoa, but it's a weird story. And then one of the other things he did that I thought was absolutely brilliant was they got him to draw like some Pokemon stuff, like official stuff.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh yeah, I've seen some of this stuff.
Yeah, and he drew like this one panel. This comes up in that listicle I mentioned, which is the 13 most unsettling Junji panels. And that is it's like a ghost. He draws a ghost type Banette, which is basically Banette is it's like a discarded toy that comes to life. It's originally a discarded doll that comes to life with a grudge against its former owner. That's how the Pokemon is formed. And then he's drawn that, and it just looks so unsettling and creepy. Like he's done such a good job with that. Like to make something that's, I mean, even the thing about Pokemon is like when you think about some of the ghost types in Pokemon, like the ghost type Pokemon, like Ghastly and such. And then you look at like the concepts behind them, like how these ghosts are supposedly formed, like these malevolent spirits or whatever. And it's actually like really, really, really unsettling, but then they look so fucking cute. It's but what he's done is he's taken the unsettling part and he's kept it unsettling, and this thing just looks horrible. Like, wow. You know. Damn.
Yeah, Pokemon are messed up.
Yeah, they are, man. Like, I look at some of the dex entries for ghost types. Just look up dex entries for ghost types, especially because that is like, it is really messed up. Like when you truly sit down and think about it. Like, but yeah, it's cool.
I guess the only thing that we haven't really talked about was actually my favorite, which is Tomie. Just because I just love how if you read like the collection of all his Tomie stories that I think came out like a couple of years ago, like just the volume with all of them together, like you can see how much his art progresses throughout, like reading it from start to finish, and like how much the character gets fleshed out and how much like the artwork just becomes so much more detailed. And I love looking at that process of like how his own art has kind of like blossomed in a way.
Yeah, because like the early chapters or issues, especially if you're not reading it in order of his other works, you go to Tomie and it's just like, like this is like, it's like some of it is it's still like cool, but some of it, the way it's composed and the way how black and white are used, sometimes it like obfuscates like the blocking or like what is actually going on in the panel at times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just love that it's almost like it's still in progress, which is almost like for some reason, like reading it as a volume, it works well because of the story as well, because it's never like complete. It's always like kind of self-replicating, like just kind of like Tomie is always kind of self-replicating, and like that blurring of boundaries I find is like it's almost jarring if you look back to like the first couple of pages and look at like the difference between like the art in the first couple panels versus like the art at the end. Like you're just like, oh man, you improved.
This is the one that I really wanted to read but didn't get round to.
It is very good. I've not seen any of the adaptations, but I love that Tomie, for me as a character, kind of encapsulates like what I love about Junji Ito's work, and that like he does the abhuman really well. And this is like one of my favorite concepts kind of in the Gothic, which is like I think Kelly Hurley defines the abhuman as like something that's liminal, admic, not quite human, characterized by its morphic variability. Like she says, continually in danger of becoming not itself, becoming other.
Yeah.
And that for me is what I love about his work, is just that liminal quality of like, this is something that's always like an unstable organic compound that's always in danger of becoming something else.
Mm.
And Tomie for me is, I think, like, especially in terms of like, we've not really talked about like the gendered issues of his work, but I think that work for me is particularly crucial in terms of like how he almost like draws women compared to like how the men are drawn.
Yeah.
But yes, that's a topic for another time.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the way that he represents gender in his work and stuff, it's very conservative, and he has this like kind of there's a lot of it's very traditional views in there, but and very very Japanese in that way as well, because it's a very Japanese attitude towards women.
Yes, I agree completely, and I find it's interesting just in how many of his monsters are gendered female, and like that kind of monstrosity. It harks back to basically like the monstrous feminine, right? Like, it's like a horror trope that you see all the time, and like I feel like Tomie kind of goes some way in kind of undoing what we think of as like the monstrous feminine, but not quite. And so like I'm always like, is this misogynistic? Probably. Do I still like it? Yes.
Wasn't it written originally for a girls' magazine? Wasn't it a shoujo manga?
Was it?
Yeah,
that's interesting.
I think that's
like
how
I read something like that.
I think that's why it's got so many adaptations as well.
Ooh.
Yeah,
I did not know that. That is vital contextual information.
Yeah, because I would agree with you in regards to the Tomie character sort of not fully bucking that trend, but complicating it. Yeah, and I think that's because she's given more complexity and a bit more agency than some of the other characters that we get. Because even in some cases, you have the character who is not the villain and is the main character, who is pretty much our protagonist or our eyes and ears. And in a lot of the stories, they are oblivious or they're not the person who solves the mystery.
Yes.
They're our eyes and ears, but they're the person who, they don't hear that sound. They don't see the spirals. That's not weird at all. And it's like, it is weird because they're the main character, but not in a way. And
absolutely, yeah.
So, Tomie, like, it wasn't TV, sorry, it was film. I got that wrong, so I just wanted to correct myself there. And if I give you the list of Tomie movies they've made, there's the original Tomie, which was made in 1998. Then there's Tomie Another Face, which is 1999. There's Tomie Replay from the year 2000. There's Tomie Rebirth in 2001. Tomie The Final Chapter, Forbidden Fruit, which was 2002. Tomie Beginning in 2005. Tomie Revenge in 2005. Tomie versus Tomie in 2007.
You're making that one up.
No, I'm not. It's there. Tomie Unlimited in 2011. So,
can I just say, I love how many franchises not the final chapter, and then it gets rebooted. It's just like origins or beginnings. So typical. It's never the final chapter because they know that they can get more money out of it.
They call it the final chapter. Yeah, I mean, I think that like, is it the Freddy and Jason films that have done that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And they just get progressively more ridiculous. But I will still go.
Tomie versus Tomie just conjures memories of Freddy versus Jason. I don't know why. Just the title. Like, I need to watch some of these, and I need to definitely read the manga, but yeah. And Yeah, I believe it was actually a shoujo. Let's have a look. I'll just double check that actually, because I don't want to I don't give you that information on the cast and then have it be wrong.
That would be really cool, though, because I think
Yeah.
I think even despite being written for like a girls' magazine, like I don't think that necessarily negates the misogynistic undertones of it, because I think a lot of the time, like, women internalize a lot of what patriarchal culture feels about them.
So yeah, Tomie, a Japanese horror manga series written and illustrated by Junji Ito. It was his first published work. He originally submitted to Monthly Halloween, which was a shoujo magazine, and it started in 1987. So yeah, it was originally for a shoujo magazine. So there you go. A magazine where the demographic is young girls.
Oh, young girls as well. That's surprising.
I think that's what it says. I think that's what shoujo is. Ray will know more about this because he reads more manga than I do.
Sorry, say that again?
It's Tomie was originally for a shoujo magazine, and
shoujo would be for girls.
Teenage female target demographic. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up, because I think in a lot of these short stories, I didn't really notice it, but I certainly felt that that compulsion to be like, is this misogynistic, but am I still enjoying it from Gyo? Because Kaori is a very particularly, like, I don't know, there's a cliche of her being like the screaming girl who doesn't know how to cope and is like constantly whining to her boyfriend. Like that set me off, but at the same time, like, what it was used in service for, I don't know. I don't know where I lie on that, I think.
Well, it's funny because, like, they make her, like, a quote-unquote shrill, and then she spends the beginning of the book being gaslighted. Like, she can smell the stench. It's like, you know that, I can't remember what it's called, the ignorance of weirdness sensor, where it's like, so it's just called the weirdness sensor, and he and a lot of protagonists have the ignorance of it, and it's stuff where he's dealt with all this crazy stuff down in Okinawa, and then they go back and it's like, it's a cockroach, you idiot, stop being so scared, and it's like, what? Like, you gotta trust her nose, she knows what's going on. But there is a lot of that at the beginning, definitely. And
for sure.
Yeah, that's like also just classic Gothic, right? There's always, like, you know, the damsel in distress who's being gaslighted and stuff. And I find that it's interesting how that theme, which is so Western to me, shows up in so much of Ito's work. Like,
it does make the ending of that story a little bit disingenuous now. Like, it's just clicked for me, because, like, at the end he's sort of giving his little monologue about how she's at peace now. It's like, well, you never listened to her to begin with.
Well, exactly. Yeah. That is a really good point too. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say it's like he intentionally makes her annoying and high maintenance at the beginning of the story. Like he has that kind of like he intentionally does that in order to, I don't know, like maybe make the protagonist appear more macho, but even he's just as useless. I don't know why he does that. Yeah, he's like totally useless, but yeah.
Yeah, and he's I don't know, the protagonist is almost the weakest part of Gyo for me.
Yeah, definitely.
He's not even, he just doesn't really do much. He's just kind of like along for the ride, and everything kind of happens to him, and he like is there to witness all these vignettes of things that are happening around him, and has little to no agency. And
he's like a total non-entity, isn't he?
He is, and he doesn't. Yeah. He's like, I have to. I have to make sure that Kaori's okay, or like I have to make sure that, like, she's at peace. But in the end, like, he's not responsible for any of these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's there as a pair of eyes for us to read through, kind of thing.
Yeah, true. Yes.
Because we experience everything through his eyes a lot of the time.
A vantage point, yeah.
It's funny you bring that up, because like at the end of book 1, or like part 1 of this, he just basically resigns himself to dying in a pit of fish. Which I've got a note saying, and then he, like, they introduce all the cephalopods, and then he falls into a pit, and then just stays there. He's like, sod it. This is the hill that I die on. Like, this is where I'm done now.
This is the hill of dead fish that I die on.
Yeah, I thought that was funny. I also thought like his uncle was a really weak part of that story because like I've got a note here saying like it's concept in service, or it's story in service of concept, where like the uncle doesn't give a shit that his house has been overrun by fish. Or I guess maybe that you can look at that retroactively and realize that he was in on it from the beginning or whatever. But like he's borrowing this seaside house from his uncle. And he's like, oh, I heard sharks attacked it. And it's like, he doesn't really do anything. He's like not paying attention to the news. And I don't know. I thought some of that stuff was a little bit ridiculous, but
yeah. He's there to be the crazy scientist he's a catalyst, isn't he? He's there to escalate the situation by building his own machine.
Well, yeah.
But yeah, no. Are we finally done?
Yes, sorry.
Yes. Does anyone else have anything else they want to add?
Yeah, it's just a small thing that I love through these books. And one of my favorite Junji Ito things is it happens so often for every book pretty much, but it's it's either when someone's noticed something weird and they don't know what to say about it, so like they just look really concerned, and their speech bubble is the ellipses, followed by and it's usually on the page flip part as well, where we just get like a close up of their eyes, and suddenly their eyes are like mega detailed, and he just has such a way of capturing just abject fear or complete befuzzlement that I always get a kick out of it, even though it's used like 100 times every comic. It's just really cool, and it's such a in my head, as well as all the gross and super hyper detailed grim stuff and imagery that we get. It's the surprise or like full abject horror reactions that I just love. I love seeing them in every book.
Yeah, he's very good at that. Is the facial expressions and things, which is just something that's just like absolutely perfect a lot of the time.
Can I just add something onto that?
Yeah.
Since you brought up eyes, Leon, this is something that I learned through from Anna, where there's an Italian expression where it's I don't know what the original Italian is, but the translation is to have the eyes of a boiled fish. Means when you stare at someone lovingly with dreamy eyes, is to have the eyes of a boiled fish. And all I could keep seeing in Gyo, like a really effective visual, is how Kaori's sort of at an angle, so her like she's 90 degrees sideways, so that her eyes are on top of each other vertically, and they're glazed over with like a fish eye. And all I could see was like she had boiled fish eyes, and all I kept hearing in my head was like she must be in love with somebody. And I just thought there's a weird dissonance between me knowing that Italian idiom and then the stuff that was on the page in Gyo.
But then me thinking of what a boiled fish's eyes look like, that's like a vacant stare, right?
I guess I think that's what it's driving at. Like when you stare dreamily into your partner's eyes from across a room, and like they glaze over, having been blinded by love. But
yeah,
just something to bear in mind next time you read that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, I like that. When the sideways eye thing, actually, that's just because there's some fish that are actually like that, aren't there? Like cod and things. Yeah. But I like that. Yeah, that's good. So that has been episode 80 of Ace Comicals, and we have discussed at length the career and work of Junji Ito, and I think we've done that quite comprehensively, don't you?
I think there's always more to say, but there's only so many hours in a day.
Exactly. Yes.
We can always do this again. And
we could go on and on, but I think as far as we've gone right now, I think we've been we've given people a pretty comprehensive dive into what it is that makes a Junji Ito book, I think. And with that, we shall close out. So this has been episode 80 of Ace Comicals. Vicky, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for joining us again. And I mean, obviously, don't be a stranger. We'll have to get you on more often for more horror-based stuff and more horror-based conversations. It's always really nice having you on here. So thank you.
M. Night Shyamalan.
Yeah. Yes, we should do the M. Night Shyamalan, yes.
I'm down for it if we get to talk about Scary Jerry from and that's so funny, the whole thing.
Yes.
But yes, be lovely to speak to you guys again.
So, you can find us at www.acecomicals, which is kind of the hub for everything we do. There will be links to all of our social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We are most active on Twitter. So Twitter's the place to follow us, I guess, if you're going to follow us anywhere. We can be reached on Twitter at Ace Comicals. You can join in with the conversation via Twitter, or you can DM us. You can ask us questions via the Twitter feed, or you can send us an email directly to acecomicals@gmail.com. You can find us to listen to us in a plethora of places. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Castbox, Castro, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, and TuneIn. Ray, where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Monke at MOONKEH.
And Leon, where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Leon Everett, and also I was guested on the most recent episode of Dynamite in the Brain, the anime podcast that we've mentioned, and the hosts are friends of the show, particularly Anthony Askew, who's been on a few times. And on that, we were discussing the final release of the Furikuri revival that Adult Swim had going on a few years ago, where we discussed Furikuri Alternate. And I've done previous episodes with those guys speaking about Furikuri Progressive. And 10 years ago, around about, maybe 9 years ago, we did an episode on Furikuri, the original series. So if you're super interested about my thoughts on that bonkers anime, check out those episodes on dynamiteinthebrain.com or on any normal podcatcher.
And while you're trawling back through Dynamite in the Brain back catalogue, you'd be able to find a fair bit of me on there as well. Because I'm on a fair few of their episodes, mostly discussing stuff like Ghost in the Shell. But yeah, Vicky, where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at M Madden. That's Vicky, VICKI, Madden spelled the normal way.
Yes. So, if you're feeling that way inclined, you can donate the price of a coffee at our Ko-fi page, which is kofi.com/acecomicals. Any donations go towards keeping the lights on and keeping the show running, basically. So keeping the website hosted and everything else. It all goes to defray the costs of running the podcast. If you stay tuned after this closeout, you will hear a short story that I have written. So this is following on from last week. So last week's episode, I've kind of gotten into this new thing where I'm like trying out writing short stories. So last week's episode, I read out a short story that I had written called Salted Caramel. And this time, I've got another one for you guys, which is called Sour Yet Sweet. And I've sent it to Ray and he's had a quick read of it. And what do you reckon, Ray?
I really like it. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing you to read this out to us. Because the one that you did for this is based on the Ice Cream Man sort of ice cream flavors concept, where you wrote salted caramel based on Marvin's favorite ice cream, and I mentioned that I like stuff that's kind of sweet and kind of sour, say like strawberry cheesecake or whatever. So you wrote a story around that. So I think people will enjoy that. Yes.
So yeah, if you stay tuned after this, I will be reading my story. So yeah, you can check that out. So thank you for joining us. That is Ace Comicals, over and out. Welcome to my attic. I am the Loft Dweller. And for you, my friends, this evening I have a chilling tale from my library of the damned. Sour yet sweet. I awoke violently to a sharp synthetic bleating. It was a Monday morning, 7 a.m. I got showered and put on my uniform and went downstairs to make coffee and contemplate the dreary mechanical monotony of the day ahead. My housemate John was already awake and dressed, seated on a stool in the kitchen looking out of the window with a blank stare. He looked clammy and was visibly shaking. I had a strange dream about... He stopped speaking as he turned to face me. I feel awful now. I'm not sure what's wrong with me. I tried to drink that, pointing at a coffee cup. But it was terrible. It was the wrong colour. Not sweet enough. Not sour enough. Had to spit it back up straight away. Just wouldn't stay down. Do we have any raspberries? No, I replied. Maybe you should see a doctor instead of going to work. You really don't look well at all. I think raspberries will sort me out, he said. I need raspberries. Maybe I can stop and get some on my way to work. Your place stocks them, right? I offered to drive him as far as the supermarket where I worked, so he could stop off and grab some of the fruit he seemed to crave. I could see a wild look in his eyes, all the way along the road in the passenger seat, his gaze darting around and around, coupled with his twitching, disturbed demeanour as he shivered next to me. I could see sweat patches forming on his shirt. He complained occasionally of a dry mouth and stomach cramps. I could hear a loud groaning and roiling coming from inside him during the silence between his complaints. When we arrived at the shop, he could hardly wait for the car to stop moving before opening the door and rushing off into the car park, sprinting towards the main entrance. By the time I'd caught up with him, he'd loaded a basket full of plastic punnets of soft, glistening red fruit. You could see John's impatience as he waited to pay. I said goodbye to him and then made my way to the staff entrance at the back of the store to clock in. He didn't come home that evening, and I assumed he had stayed out with colleagues. The next time I saw him was the following morning. I awoke to find the bathroom covered with vomit, and the kitchen fridge stacked to bursting, full of raspberries. John, sitting on the floor, covered with red juice, continuously stuffing his face, his eyes wide and his pupils dilated, munching, juice running down his chin, all the while mumbling a sort of mantra to himself. So sour, so sweet. I stepped closer. He still looked ill. Sweating and pale, he was wearing yesterday's clothes, now stained red with raspberry. I tried to get his attention, to ask him if he was okay, but there was no response. He appeared catatonic. All of a sudden, he got up from the mess of sticky crushed fruit on the floor and began to shuffle through the sea of empty plastic containers towards his room. I heard the door shut and the lock snap. I cleaned as much as I could. The following few days I only ever saw my housemate in brief. Each time I did see him, he was well covered, wearing several layers, his posture slowly getting worse, and his movements more laboured, almost as if he were aging rapidly. I would try to see if I could catch sight of any activity from the garden through his window positioned at the back of the house, but all attempts were in vain, as his curtains were firmly drawn at all times. I caught him returning to the house from the shop, where he had purchased more raspberries, all the time muttering to himself about the sweet yet sour flavour, and how nothing else was comparable. I could hear him rant late into the night about his insatiable hunger, the feel of the soft fruit in his hands, and the delicate glistening red globules, ordered so neatly in a pile full of juice. His praise and devotion to the raspberry seemed almost religious at this point, like he had become part of a cult. My concern for him increased, and I would bang on his door to try and get an answer, to see if he was okay, to maybe try and convince him to speak to a doctor. He would never open the door, and his reply was always the same, that he only needed more raspberries. I even reached out to some of his friends and family, but no one could get a decent response from him. Only his mother was successful in getting him to leave his room for anything other than more fruit. He turned violent when we denied him access to his beloved berries, and in an effort to calm and restrain him, some of his filthy red sticky blankets and items of clothing he had wrapped himself in began to loosen. We caught sight of his hands and his face, his skin now red and covered in glistening boils and blisters of all sizes, much like the globules that make up a raspberry. His hands were the same, and the flesh of his fingers had begun to fuse. He snatched the filthy rags and coverings back over his body. Hunched and twisted, he squelched back up to his room. About a week and a half had passed. One morning, after a sleepless night listening to John's ranting through the walls, I found a thick, sticky red substance oozing from behind his door. Some of it had hardened like sap, creating a seal. I decided to go out and investigate from the back garden and look up at his window, knowing somehow this would be futile. The same substance seemed to be oozing from around the window and was dripping down the side of the house. By this point I had already been making arrangements to live elsewhere, as I could not stand the constant madness any longer. I went back into the house and made my way up to his bedroom door to commence slamming and shouting with increasing volume for an answer, begging him to come out and seek help. At some point I lost my temper and hit the door way too hard. I was brought back to my senses by a wet thud and a splash, like the sound of a water balloon bursting. The door had split and the red liquid now oozed from the crack down the middle. I stepped back for a moment, then decided to begin another assault on the door, this time with the goal of gaining entry to see what was going on. The lock gave way at the behest of my foot as I kicked and burst open only so far before hitting something soft. I could hear a low moaning, delirious whispers about the soft, sweet fruit. I squeezed my way into the room through the gap at the broken door. I was confronted with a sight, the strangeness of which would defy all I had ever known or learned. The walls were covered in thick red sap and blister-like bumps, similar to what I had seen briefly on John's hands and face. All of the possessions and furniture were broken and glued to the walls and floor with hardened red sap, almost like he had created a nest or a cocoon. In the centre of the room there was what looked like a giant misshapen raspberry. But on closer inspection it was a man curled up into the fetal position, wrapped in a membrane of some sort. He was covered in red blisters with swollen pink skin. The flesh of his limbs looked melted and fused, his face almost no longer there, the features obscured by blisters. It was John. His one remaining eye slowly opened. "I am sour, yet I am sweet," he said.